They survived a world where a single glance could cost a head. Behind the crowns and gowns was a court built on whispers, fear, and quiet betrayals no one dared to name. Every woman who stepped into Tudor power learned that influence was real only until someone decided it wasn't. And every downfall began long before the blade was raised. Tonight, don't you will walk their corridors and see how silence became the sharpest weapon of all. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into the galleries of a Tudor palace, the first thing one might notice is how beauty seems to float through the air like a gentle fragrance. Soft enough to calm the eyes, but sharp enough to cut through a woman's life without warning. It would not appear dangerous at first glance. A lowered gaze, a careful smile, a hint of grace in the way a gown moved across the polished floors. These were gestures that looked harmless, even tender. Yet beneath that still surface lived a tension so constant that it became part of the architecture itself. Every woman inside those walls walked as if her footsteps might disturb something unseen. Something waiting to twist her smallest gesture into a question of loyalty. Beauty was present. Yes, but so was fear. Woven into every breath, the palace did not need swords to make threats. Its corridors worked through whispers, and its chambers judged through glances. A tilt of the head could mean deference or deception. A murmur in the wrong ear could ignite suspicion. Nothing was fixed. Everything could be interpreted, expanded, poisoned. It is darkly amusing that the same look praised in one morning could be condemned by nightfall. Those who lived there understood the rules even when no one said them aloud. Every expression had weight. Every silence had motive. And every moment of softness could be transformed into evidence of something far more dangerous. Women inside the Tudor court were expected to remain gentle, graceful, and agreeable on the surface. Underneath, they had to think faster than their rivals, anticipate dangers no one openly acknowledged, and navigate an environment where affection could become a weapon without warning. The king's presence amplified everything. Any woman who caught his attention, even by accident, became a subject of scrutiny. The eyes of the court shifted toward her like a tightening circle, measuring her worth, questioning her intentions, and preparing to turn her beauty into the reason for her downfall. There were days when a smile from the king could secure favor, and others when that same smile could mark someone for ruin. No one ever knew which version of fate they were receiving. In a world where alliances changed with the temperature of the room, beauty was not a shield, it was an exposed throat. A woman's appearance, posture, and composure were read like texts, interpreted through layers of jealousy, ambition, and fear. If compared to modern life, it would be like working in a place where every co-worker watches your breathing, waiting to decide whether it proves your innocence or guilt. The pressure was constant, unyielding, and designed to break those who misunderstood how to wield their own presence. The danger was not always loud. It often appeared as a quiet observation. Someone standing too long at the edge of a doorway. Someone is listening from a corner. Someone noticing who laughed at whose joke, who nodded at whose remark, who avoided whose eyes. None of these gestures mattered individually, yet they became meaningful when collected like threads pulled from a garment. Enough threads removed, and the gown unravelled. Enough whispers gathered, and a woman's reputation began to dissolve. Servants, courtiers, ladies in waiting. They all contributed in small ways to the atmosphere. They watched, carried information, and passed on impressions. A soft greeting could become a rumour. A private conversation could travel through 3 rooms before a woman even realized she had been seen. The court spoke one language, but listened in another. Words did not need to be spoken clearly to be understood. Intentions did not need confirmation before they were judged. I find it unsettling how quickly admiration could turn into accusation, as if affection itself contained its own poison. Beauty, then, was not an asset. It was a responsibility, a burden, and often a trap. The king admired beauty, but he also feared its consequences. A beautiful woman inspired desire, and desire inspired suspicion. Suspicion inspired interrogations, and interrogations inspired downfall. The cycle repeated so many times that some women learned to dim themselves, lowering their presence like a candle beneath a glass. They avoided the king's eyes. They softened their colours. They practiced a kind of strategic invisibility, hoping the lack of attention would grant them a longer life. But invisibility had its dangers as well. A woman who appeared too subdued could be accused of hiding something. A woman who avoided attention could be interpreted as withholding loyalty. There was no safe balance. The court demanded perfection while punishing any attempt to reach it. A misread expression could ruin a lifetime of careful behavior. A single witness could twist a harmless moment into evidence of treachery. The king did not need proof in the way modern courts might demand. Interpretation was enough. Fear was enough. Consensus among rivals was enough. The palace functioned as a living organism. It fed on observation, suspicion, and unspoken rules. Women became fluent in these rules, not by choice but by survival. Their steps slowed in certain rooms. Their smiles thinned at certain times. Their voices lowered to levels safe enough not to trigger inquiry. They carried themselves not as individuals but as reflections of the political weather. Each day presented a new risk, a new potential for misunderstanding, a new chance for their beauty to betray them. Some women rose in this environment, but they rose carefully, like climbing a ladder whose rungs were coated in oil. They mastered the art of looking without being too bold, speaking without being too confident, and existing without leaving too much impression. They survived by becoming readable, but not predictable, admired, but not envied, graceful, but not threatening. It was a balance few could maintain for long. The ones who failed left lessons behind, carved into the memory of the court like faint scratches on its wooden panels. In such a place, beauty was a language with deadly grammar. A misplaced gesture could create a sentence no woman wished to hear spoken about her. A misinterpreted glance could rearrange the story of her life. A single whisper could seal her fate. Within these rules, women were both celebrated and cornered, lifted and crushed, adored and destroyed. Beauty was not meant for affection. It was meant for caution. It was meant to remind every woman that the court did not reward charm. It consumed it. The quiet tension inside these halls lingers long after the scenes fade. Something unspoken continues to shift beneath the polished surface of courtly life. And there will come a moment when a whisper meant for no one becomes the reason a queen begins to tremble. They moved through the palace with quiet steps, their presence woven into the rhythm of daily life, yet never acknowledged openly in the language of power. No decree bore their names, no council summoned their voices, and no official record allowed them a seat at the table. And still, the shape of Tudor politics bent around them in ways that were impossible to ignore. Their influence did not enter through doors, it seeped through walls, through whispers, through the thin space between one heartbeat and the next. What they could not declare publicly, they carried out in the margins, where politics thrived without needing permission. In those corridors, a woman's silence was never truly silent. It could soften alliances, sharpen rivalries, or push a nobleman toward a risk he might otherwise avoid. Even a lady in waiting, standing a short distance from the queen, could tilt the balance of the court simply by mentioning who smiled at whom, who avoided whose company. who lingered too long in a doorway. None of these women spoke directly of policy, but their observations travelled far beyond them. They fed the minds of men who made decisions, and in doing so, shaped the kingdom from behind its curtains. It is bitterly ironic that those stripped of authority often handled its sharpest edges. The Queen herself lived in a paradox. She was expected to embody virtue, grace, and loyalty, while navigating a landscape in which every expression could be interpreted as political intent. Her friendships were monitored, her alliances scrutinized, her smallest actions measured with a precision reserved for matters of national security. She could not debate openly, yet her opinions were sought in private when the king's ear turned toward comfort rather than command. When she succeeded, others called it luck. When she stumbled, they called it deceit. She was essential, and she was indispensable. Ladies-in-waiting occupied an even stranger space. They were part confidant, part witness, part liability. They dressed the Queen, assisted her prayers, and listened to her anxieties. They saw her at her strongest and her weakest. This intimacy gave them access to delicate truths, and delicate truths were the currency of survival. A single remark, uttered at the wrong moment, could tie a woman's fate to someone else's ambition. A dropped comment about the king's mood, a whisper about who entered which chamber, a sigh was overheard after a long meeting. These fragments drifted outward like dust, settling on the minds of those looking for meaning. If this were a modern workplace, it would resemble an office where gossip has more force than the official hierarchy. The women who served the Queen understood that their influence was both valuable and dangerous. They carried their knowledge carefully, storing it like fragile glass that could either protect them or shatter in their hands. A woman who passed along information too eagerly risked suspicion. One who kept too much to herself risked the same. There was no safe distance between speaking and silence. Survival meant choosing what to reveal, when to reveal it, and to whom. The wrong choice could lead to interrogation, imprisonment, or the quiet erasure that left no trace in the records. Power among Tudor women did not always appear as ambition. Sometimes it appeared as caution, sometimes as diplomacy, sometimes as the instinct to withdraw before a storm forms. But whether active or passive, intentional or accidental, their influence was undeniable. They made informed decisions without attending councils. They shaped perceptions without speaking in public. They affected the king's heart, and through it, the kingdom's stability. Even the briefest shift in their standing could send ripples through the hierarchy around them. Marriages, too, were political negotiations disguised as personal unions. A woman's entry into the palace through marriage created new alliances, redirected old loyalties, introduced unfamiliar voices, and altered the dynamic of entire factions. A bride was not simply a wife, she was a symbol of promise, threat, or opportunity. Her family gained or lost status through her behavior, and her reputation became a weapon others tried to seize. A misplaced word could damage her lineage. A misinterpreted gesture could provoke animosity, and a single whisper questioning her loyalty could undo years of careful positioning. Even the youngest maidservants participated in this hidden system. Their task might have been small: carrying water, arranging garments, cleaning rooms, but their access was enormous. They were present when noble women spoke freely. They overheard confessions meant for trusted ears. They observed who visited whose chamber and at what hour. In a palace where information outranked truth, these observations were as lethal as any blade. A servant's testimony could elevate a rival or condemn a queen. Yet the same servant could disappear quietly if she became inconvenient. What made Tudor women's political presence so intricate was that it relied not on title but on perception. They were judged not by their actions alone, but by how those actions were interpreted by a watching world. A woman who lingered in the wrong hallway could be accused of scheming. One who laughed too brightly at a nobleman's joke might be suspected of impropriety. One who prayed too fervently might be accused of overcompensating for guilt. Everything they did, every movement, every absence, became evidence. The court functioned like a vast echo chamber, where meanings stretched and distorted until they no longer resembled their origins. Women existed inside this distortion, forced to adapt to a narrative that shifted without warning. Some adapted well, moving with deliberate subtlety, turning invisibility into advantage. Others failed to read the room, believing sincerity would protect them. It never did. Behind the facade of obedience, these women built delicate networks. They shared warnings in coded remarks. They offered support through their actions rather than their words. They traded knowledge in small increments, being careful not to reveal too much. Their influence grew in shadows. But shadows were exactly where Tudor politics lived most comfortably. When men spoke of honour and governance, these women whispered of survival and consequence. I have always been struck by how those considered powerless managed to bend the course of history with nothing more than perception, timing, and the courage to speak softly where others shouted. They shaped the court not through authority but through proximity, not through law but through intuition. Their existence remained unrecorded in official documents, yet their fingerprints rested on the decisions that defined an era. They were present, but not acknowledged, influential, but not credited, visible, but not seen. Their quiet movements still linger in the corners of those ancient rooms, shaping the memory of a world that refused to name them. Something fragile yet dangerous continues to pulse beneath their footsteps, and in that dimness, a single rumour will rise and seal the fate of a queen whose eyes lingered where they should not have. The laws that governed Tudor England rarely needed to mention women directly. Their absence from the written rules was deliberate, a silence shaped into authority. A married woman did not own the coins in her pocket, the garments on her body, or even the thoughts she expressed aloud. Everything she had, property, reputation, voice, passed into the hands of her husband the moment vows were spoken. The law treated this transfer as natural, effortless, and unquestionable. For women, it felt like stepping into a room where the door closed quietly behind them, leaving no clear path out. Inside that system, a woman's dignity became something fragile, easily bruised, and impossible to defend. Public insult could stain her character for a lifetime, yet she had no legal means to confront the damage. She could not accuse a man of slander without his permission. She could not challenge the witnesses who distorted her behaviour into something shameful. What others said shaped who she became in the eyes of society, and she had no weapon to counter their words. It is grimly amusing that a world obsessed with honour refused to grant women any tools to protect their own. Power rested entirely on interpretation, and interpretation rarely favoured those without standing. If a woman spoke too boldly, her confidence was called insolence. If she hesitated, her silence suggested guilt. If she expressed grief, she was accused of manipulation. If she remained composed, she was hiding something. Every reaction had a shadow attached to it, a darker meaning waiting to be pulled forward by those who needed justification for their suspicions. In the eyes of the law, a woman was not a full participant in society. She was a vessel through which accusations travelled easily. Rumours carried more force than testimony. A whispered suggestion could destroy her far faster than any documented offence. Those who wished to discredit her did not need evidence. They needed only an audience willing to listen. A servant's claim, a jealous rival's remark, a misinterpreted gesture. Each could unravel her stability more effectively than a formal charge. And once suspicion settled on her, the law offered little defence. She could speak, but her speech did not carry weight. She could deny, But denial sounded like a strategy rather than the truth. It would be like standing in a courtroom today where every verdict is decided before a word is spoken. Marriage amplified these dangers. A husband could accuse his wife of misconduct with more credibility than she could defend herself. A nobleman's influence often mattered more than reality. If he wished to reshape his household, rid himself of political inconvenience, or redirect blame for his own missteps, the law provided a quiet path for him to do so. A woman's misfortune could be written into the record as her own fault. With no space to challenge the conclusion, even queens lived under this legal fog. The crown did not shield them from interpretations that twisted their behaviour into treason. Their marriages placed them at the centre of political scrutiny. Yet the law gave them no authority to resist the forces that judged them. A queen could be adored in one season and condemned in the next. Her fate determined not by the truth of her actions, but by the stories others constructed around her. To lose favour with the king was to lose the protections of the law entirely. Where the king's word became judgment, there was no appeal, no refuge, no recourse. Women of lower rank faced the same void, but without the visibility that sometimes offered queens a few moments of hesitation before a sentence fell. Their struggles unfolded quietly, unnoticed, except by those who shared their vulnerability. A wife abandoned by her husband could not claim her own property back. A woman mistreated in public had no path to restore her name. A daughter whose inheritance was consumed by male relatives had no place to contest her loss. The law did not fail these women. It simply never acknowledged them to begin with. What made this system especially cruel was the illusion that women were protected. Statutes referenced their safety, sermons praised their virtue, and society spoke endlessly of their importance within the home. Yet when the moment came to defend them, the same structures that claimed to honour them withdrew and left them standing alone. Their value was symbolic, not legal, expected, not guaranteed. I have always been unsettled by how a society could build its moral identity on the backs of those it refused to treat as full human beings. In Tudor England, legality did not reflect justice. It reflected control. Control exercised quietly, consistently, and without resistance from the institutions meant to ensure fairness. Women learned to navigate this landscape not through the protection of law, but through the careful management of perception, alliance, and silence. Their survival depended not on their rights, but on their ability to avoid giving anyone reason to question their place. They existed within the system, yet outside its protections. Visible only when accused, heard only when convenient, valued only when silent. The law watched them without recognizing them, judged them without listening to them, and used them without acknowledging their humanity. Their erasure lingers in the margins of every record they were never allowed to write. A tension remains between the world that governed them and the world they tried to endure. Somewhere in that fragile space, a single allegation will rise quietly enough to end a woman before she understands its source. Her presence in the Tudor court never needed an introduction. It was felt before it was understood. A quiet disruption that unsettled those who believed beauty and intelligence should never coexist in a woman of ambition. Anne Boleyn entered the palace not as a threat but as a fascination. A figure whose sharp mind and poised elegance drew attention without effort. Yet fascination was a dangerous form of currency. It invited observation, jealousy, and invention. What began as admiration soon bent into suspicion, shaped by those who feared what a clever woman might become once the king's gaze began to follow her. Anne's rise was not sudden. It unfolded through small moments. Glances exchanged across crowded rooms, curtsies that lingered a fraction longer than expected, and a subtle confidence that suggested she knew the power of being seen. Her beauty was not the soft kind the court preferred. It had edges. It demanded notice. It is unsettlingly ironic how a woman's intelligence, when paired with charm, could be mistaken for sorcery by those who lacked both. Those who felt threatened by her influence whispered explanations that made them feel safer. She must have used enchantments, hidden arts, something unnatural to bend the king's will. The truth was far more ordinary. Henry admired her refusal to yield. When she became queen, the air around her shifted. The same qualities that once captivated the court now weighed heavily against her. Her wit became insolence. Her confidence became pride. Her grace became manipulation. The very traits that raised her above her rivals became the reasons those rivals waited for her fall. In a palace, where reputation mattered more than reality, her enemies learned to craft stories that sounded believable simply because she had proven herself capable of more than they expected. Each rumor about her past, each accusation about her conduct, was another thread pulled loose from the delicate fabric she had woven around herself. Her marriage to Henry placed her at the center of a storm she could not control. Every miscarriage became a sign of divine displeasure. Every disagreement with the king fed whispers that she was dangerous. Those who had once sought her favor now sensed vulnerability and stepped back. Courtiers who had praised her charm began repeating tales of her temper. Advisors who once valued her insight now wondered if she overstepped. Henry himself, once consumed by desire for her, began to view her through the distortions created by others. In a court fueled by rivalry, the charge of infidelity required no proof. Only a narrative. Stories spread easily, stretching across the palace like smoke. A musician looked at her too fondly. A courtier bowed too deeply. A friend spoke to her in a private corridor. None of these moments was incriminating. Yet each could be shaped into something dangerous by those who wished to see her undone. If judged by modern standards, it would be like condemning someone based on rumors overheard in crowded hallways, where every smile is treated as evidence. The most grotesque accusation was the claim that she had lain with her own brother. It revealed more about the imagination of her accusers than about her life. Yet the court did not require truth. It required resolution. Her enemies had gathered enough fragments of suspicion to assemble a portrait that suited their needs. The king, exhausted by disappointment and lured toward another woman, accepted the picture placed before him. Whether he believed it or merely found it convenient no longer mattered. Once the decision was made, the machinery of accusation moved swiftly. Anne faced her trial with clarity. She understood that the verdict had been carved long before she entered the room. She spoke with dignity because dignity was the only power she had left. Those who observed her later remarked on her composure, her insistence on truth, even when truth had no value in the eyes of those prepared to condemn her. Her intelligence, once celebrated, now served only to make her appear defiant. Her beauty, once irresistible, now helped secure her fate. The court saw in her the perfect symbol of ambition punished. As she walked toward the scaffold, the air around her seemed stripped of all the illusions that had once buoyed her rise. The crowd that gathered to watch did so out of curiosity, fear, or the quiet relief of seeing someone else bear the consequences of a world ruled by unpredictable power. She met her death, not as a villain, but as a woman caught between a king's shifting desires and a system designed to make her visible only long enough to erase her. Anne Boleyn's downfall was not inevitable. It was constructed, shaped by whispers and silences, by those who found it easier to destroy her than to accept the possibility that she had simply been extraordinary. Her story still rests in the uneasy space between admiration and fear. The echoes of her trial linger like a stain the court never fully erased. In the quiet that follows, a single glance will begin the unmaking of another queen. Her presence in the court felt like a soft breath against stone, barely noticeable at first, yet capable of reshaping everything around her without lifting a single finger. Jane Seymour entered the king's attention not through boldness or wit, but through a stillness so complete that it became its own form of influence. In a world that fed on conflict, ambition, and spectacle, her quiet obedience appeared comforting. Where Anne Boleyn had been sharp, Jane seemed smooth. Where Anne provoked, Jane yielded. This contrast alone was enough to turn silence into a strategy. She did not need whispered alliances or calculated displays of charm. Her greatest strength was the absence of anything threatening. Jane understood how deeply the court longed for calm after years of tension, and she embodied the very picture of serenity. The king, exhausted by turmoil, looked at her and saw the promise of simplicity. She bowed at the right moments, spoke softly when spoken to, and carried herself with a gentleness that made her seem incapable of disruption. It is strangely amusing how passivity can be mistaken for purity when viewed by those desperate for stability. Her demeanor became a mirror for the king's desires. He projected onto her a kind of moral clarity, believing she represented everything Anne had not been. Jane's supposed innocence became a political shield for everyone who supported her rise. By presenting her as a calm alternative, they offered the king an escape from the choices he regretted but refused to confront. Jane did not need to argue her case. Others argued it for her. Her silence created space for stories others wanted to believe. In the palace, power rarely moved in straight lines. It drifted, shifted, gathered around those who seemed least likely to wield it. Jane's quietness invited trust, and trust invited opportunity. She did not confront the king, she reassured him. She did not challenge his decisions, she softened them. This tenderness, whether genuine or learned, became the foundation of her influence. In a modern setting, it would be like watching the least outspoken person in a room slowly gain control, simply because they never provoke resistance. Yet her gentleness should not be mistaken for weakness. Jane understood the danger of appearing too involved in her own rise. The downfall of Anne Boleyn had revealed how quickly the court could devour a woman who appeared ambitious. Jane avoided this perception with remarkable precision. She offered sympathy instead of strategy, virtue instead of vision. Behind this calm exterior, however, she positioned herself exactly where the king's favor would fall, knowing that the absence of resistance could be more persuasive than any argument. Those who supported her recognized this advantage. They rallied around her as the ideal replacement, a woman whose lack of controversy could restore a sense of order. Her role grew larger, not because she pursued it, but because others needed her to represent their hopes for a quieter court. Every time she lowered her eyes, every time she responded gently, they saw a future untainted by the chaos of the past. In becoming their symbol, she held more influence than many realized. When Jane finally became queen, the contrast between her and Anne was used as a political tool. She was praised as virtuous, pious, obedient, the embodiment of every quality that made male rulers feel secure. With each compliment, the court further solidified the idea that calmness equaled moral superiority. Jane's image became a lesson, a warning, and a comfort all at once. She did not need to speak. Her stillness carried meaning. But quiet power has edges of its own. By aligning herself with the king's longing for redemption, Jane walked into a role filled with invisible dangers. Her purity could be celebrated only as long as she remained unblemished by conflict. Any misstep would fracture the delicate narrative surrounding her. Yet she moved carefully, preserving the illusion that helped elevate her in the first place. Her influence triumphed precisely because it left no fingerprints. The removal of Anne Boleyn, the shift in court factions, and the king's renewed confidence. These events unfolded around Jane like a storm circling a still pond. She did not cause the chaos, yet she was central to its resolution. Her silence allowed others to act, and her composure prevented suspicion from touching her. In a world that punished outspoken women, she survived by becoming a blank surface onto which others could project whatever they wished. Jane Seymour's legacy is often described as gentle, but gentleness in the Tudor court was never simple. It was selective, intentional, and deeply politicized. Her silence allowed her to rise in a palace where voices were used as weapons. Her passivity protected her from the scrutiny that destroyed others. She ascended through restraint. Not force, through absence. Not assertion. And in this stillness, she achieved what many louder, brighter women could not. She became irreplaceable at the very moment the king needed her most. Her quiet ascent leaves a faint tremor beneath the stories told about her. The court's relief in her presence masks the cost of what had been undone to make space for her. Within that calm facade, another woman will soon sense the shift that determines who survives and who does not. The Tudor court functioned like a vast stage, where every gesture was read as intention. And no gesture was scrutinized more intensely than a woman's gaze. Eyes spoke in places where words were dangerous, carrying meanings that shifted as quickly as the mood of those interpreting them. A glance held a heartbeat too long could be labeled seduction. Averted eyes could be called guilt. A neutral expression was merely an empty page onto which others wrote their own suspicions. In a world this watchful, a woman's gaze became both her language and her liability. Women learned early that their eyes were not their own. They belonged to the court, to its expectations, to the unpredictable interpretations of those who watched more closely than they admitted. A queen had to master the art of looking without appearing bold, noticing without seeming curious, acknowledging without inviting accusation. Her eyes had to reflect devotion, restraint, humility, qualities men demanded but rarely possessed themselves. Even the simple act of meeting the king's gaze required calibration. Too eager, and she appeared manipulative. Too shy, and she seemed insincere. Among courtiers, glances passed like currency. A raised eyebrow could hint at an alliance. A quick look away could signal danger. Those standing along the walls of great halls learned to observe conversations without being caught watching. They communicated through subtle shifts, the tightening of eyelids, the flicker toward a rival, the downward glance meant to hide alarm. It is almost darkly humorous how the smallest motion of an eye could ignite more fear than a drawn sword in that palace. The danger intensified when the king entered the room. His attention could elevate or destroy, and women were painfully aware of how closely others watched for any trace of connection. If his eyes lingered on someone, the court whispered. If he ignored someone, the court whispered louder. Those who hoped to avoid trouble lowered their gaze respectfully. Never too quickly, never too slowly. They walked a tightrope where the only safety was to look just enough, but never more. Some women, especially ladies in waiting, learned to use their eyes as shields. They kept their gazes soft, unfocused, drifting just beside the person they addressed. This gave the impression of humility while protecting them from accusations of impropriety. Others weaponized their eyes more deliberately. A pointed glance at the wrong time could expose an affair, topple an alliance, or plant doubt in someone's mind. Eyes became tools of influence, capable of steering narratives without a single word spoken. But the court punished those who wielded this power too confidently. A woman rumored to have exchanged meaningful glances with a man risked being accused of treasonous desire. A wife whose husband fell out of favor could be blamed simply for the way she looked at another courtier. Charges of adultery often began with nothing more than someone claiming they saw a glance too intimate to be innocent. In modern terms, it would be like losing everything because someone misread a look you barely remembered giving. Anne Boleyn's fall revealed the brutal efficiency of this system. Her sharp gaze, once admired for its intelligence, became evidence of defiance. Her manner of looking at men, confident and assessing, was used against her in ways she never intended. Even those who pitied her whispered that her eyes had been her downfall. The court believed that a woman who looked too boldly must surely think too boldly, and a woman who thought too boldly must be dangerous. Other women absorbed this lesson with painful clarity. They tempered their gazes, softened their expressions, and trained themselves to appear neither too watchful nor too vacant. The Queen's household resembled a garden of expressionless faces, each one disciplined into neutrality. Yet neutrality itself was suspect. A woman who looked at nothing could be hiding everything. A woman who looked at everything could be revealing too much. The court drew no lines. And so women were forced to craft their own silent rules for survival. Men, meanwhile, he enjoyed the privilege of being interpreters rather than subjects. They judged women's glances freely, reading meaning where none existed, bending implications to their advantage. A man's testimony about a woman's gaze often carried more weight than her own denial. If he claimed she looked at him with desire, few questioned him. If she claimed she did not, few believed her. The execution records of the era reveal how many women died, not from action, but from interpretation. Glances became evidence. Silence became confession. And the inability to control how others perceived their eyes became a fatal weakness. The court needed no physical proof, only the suggestion that a woman's gaze had wandered where it should not. To live under such scrutiny was to inhabit a fragile existence. Women walked through rooms aware that every blink could echo beyond its moment. They avoided eye contact with certain men entirely, not out of fear of impropriety, but out of fear that impropriety could be invented. Their eyes became trained instruments of caution, narrowing and widening with precision, never resting too long on anything that might betray them. A gaze should have been a simple human gesture. In Tudor England, it was a blade, sharp, all silent, and easily turned against the one who held it. Their eyes are still remembered more for how others judged them than for what they truly saw. The tension between looking and being seen remains etched in the stories of their fates. From that tension will rise the downfall of a young woman unprepared for how quickly innocence can be rewritten into guilt. She entered the court with a brightness that felt almost out of place, a soft laughter that moved through the corridors like sunlight slipping into a room meant to stay dim. Catherine Howard was young enough to believe that affection could protect her, young enough to imagine that joy itself was harmless. In the Tudor court, such innocence was a dangerous kind of blindness. Her youth drew attention, her beauty drew desire, and her lack of caution drew eyes that saw opportunity long before she understood the cost of being seen. Raised far from the machinery of politics, Catherine stepped into queenship before she could grasp the weight of its shadows. She believed smiles were simply smiles, not negotiations. She thought admiration was kindness, not calculation. Her world, shaped by fragmented memories of light-hearted companionship, left her unprepared for a palace where every gesture carried potential consequence. It is painfully ironic that the court valued her cheerfulness only when it needed someone easy to mold and easier to condemn. The letters she once wrote in playful secrecy had followed her into this new life like forgotten traps. They were not composed with strategy or deceit. They were written by a girl who had not yet learned that words preserved on paper could become weapons in the hands of those hungry for influence. Her past affections were harmless in intent, but intent had never mattered in Tudor England. What mattered were the stories others could carve from small fragments of truth. At first, those fragments seemed insignificant. A note penned quickly, a promise made lightly, a sentiment too tender for a court built on suspicion. Then concerns began to circulate. Quiet observations grew into whispered questions. People wondered why she blushed at certain names, why she avoided certain topics, and why she retreated into uneasy silence when her past was mentioned. Nothing concrete surfaced, yet the absence of clarity made her vulnerable. In the Tudor court, ambiguity was rarely interpreted with generosity. The king adored her with a softness he had not shown in years. Catherine, believing this affection was enough to shield her, did not recognize how precarious her position had become. The more Henry cherished her, the more others grew intent on uncovering flaws that could be transformed into accusations. A beloved queen was not universally celebrated. She was a threat to those who lost influence when her presence brightened the king's mood. Her joy, once refreshing, now made her a target. Whispers sharpened when old acquaintances resurfaced. Servants who once knew her in moments of youthful indiscretion carried knowledge that could be twisted to fit any narrative the court desired. Their testimonies, fueled by fear, resentment, or the promise of reward, painted Catherine as a woman whose past contradicted the image of purity that crown and ceremony demanded. A modern mind might see her as someone punished not for her actions, but for lacking the awareness to erase the traces of a life lived before she understood its consequences. Her downfall accelerated when those incriminating letters reappeared. They were small things, thin sheets of inked affection, but they carried a weight she could not lift. What she saw as remnants of a girlhood romance were seized as proof of betrayal. Words, once innocent, became the pillars of a case built to consume her. For the court, her intentions did not matter. What mattered was the convenience of transforming her into an example, a reminder that a queen must arrive already perfected, untouched by human error. Catherine's confusion in the face of these accusations revealed just how deeply she misunderstood the nature of power. She tried to explain her past with honesty, believing honesty itself held value. She pleaded for understanding, not out of manipulation but out of genuine distress. Yet her sincerity made her appear naive rather than truthful. In a court where everyone twisted truth for survival, her straightforwardness seemed unreal, even suspicious. As investigations deepened, her bright laughter faded. Those who once basked in her cheerfulness now kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with a woman whose reputation unraveled rapidly. Catherine, who had always interpreted attention as affection, found herself surrounded by silence. She faced a world she had never learned to decipher, one where allies vanished unless bribed, and kindness dissolved at the slightest threat of danger. The final days of her life were marked by a dawning awareness she should never have had to gain. She realized too late that joy was not armor, that beauty attracted both admiration and hunger, and that youth was no shield against a court that punished vulnerability more quickly than dishonesty. The girl who once fluttered through the palace like a small spark found herself extinguished by forces she could not comprehend. Catherine Howard did not fall because she was wicked or manipulative. She fell because she believed too deeply in the harmlessness of her own emotions. In a kingdom ruled by suspicion, her innocence was interpreted as cunning, her past as betrayal, and her softness as a fatal flaw. She died not as a schemer, but as a child who had wandered into a world where childhood had no place. Her brief radiance lingers as a reminder of how swiftly light is smothered in a realm that feeds on shadows. The court's appetite for purity revealed itself only when purity could be broken. Within that cruel rhythm, another woman will rise, by relying not on innocence, but on intellect. She arrived in the Tudor court, not as a radiant symbol of youth or seduction, but as a woman who understood the fragility of survival better than most who had walked those halls before her. Catherine Parr carried a calm intelligence that did not seek attention, and a steadiness that came from witnessing how easily a queen could be reshaped into a cautionary tale. Her strength did not rest in beauty or charm, it rested in restraint. The rare ability to think before speaking, to observe before acting, and to sense danger before it fully formed. Catherine was not naive about the man she was marrying. She had seen what Henry VIII had done to the wives who preceded her. She knew the pattern well enough to recognize that the wrong gesture, the wrong word, or the wrong ally could unravel her stability in a single day. Yet she stepped into the marriage with a clarity that set her apart from those who hoped to win the king's affection through purity or passion. Catherine aimed not to enchant him, but to outlast him, and that alone made her exceptional. It is almost grimly amusing that survival, rather than love, became the most practical form of devotion a woman could offer a king. Her intellect was not the flamboyant type that drew admiration. It was quiet and methodical, woven into conversations gently enough that it appeared harmless. She read widely, wrote with precision, and engaged in theological debates with a subtlety that masked how much she truly understood. Yet Catherine also recognized how thin the line was between intellectual curiosity and political danger. She knew when to offer insight, and more importantly, when to withdraw it. There were moments when she allowed the king to believe an idea was his. Moments when she dimmed her intelligence to avoid provoking the insecurities that had destroyed queens far brighter than she pretended to be. The court saw her as a calming presence, a woman who brought order without demanding recognition. This perception protected her, though it did not erase the risks surrounding her. Her interest in religious reform made her vulnerable in a realm where theology was used as a weapon. Her conversations with scholars drew suspicion from those who preferred to keep faith and politics locked tightly in the king's grip. Catherine understood this tension instinctively. When the atmosphere shifted, she shifted with it. In a modern world, she would be the person who can sense when a meeting is turning dangerous and step back before anyone notices the retreat. Her greatest trial emerged when her religious beliefs became the subject of inquiry. Henry's advisors, eager to remove anyone who might influence the king away from their own agendas, attempted to use her theological interests as evidence of disobedience. Rumours gathered quietly, like dust in the corners of a rarely cleaned room. They suggested she challenged the king's authority, that her discussions overstepped the limits tolerated by the crown, that her piety concealed something more radical than reverence. Catherine recognized the shift before the accusations solidified. She approached the king not with defiance, but with humility so deliberate it bordered on strategy. She framed her discussions not as instruction but as devotion, insisting that her engagement with religious texts came from a desire to learn, not to teach. Her words softened the king's pride rather than challenging it. Henry, flattered by her supposed dependence on his wisdom, abandoned the idea of punishing her, where another queen might have pleaded innocence too boldly. Catherine survived by appealing to the king's vanity rather than his judgment. She understood that victory in the Tudor court did not lie in proving one's worth, but in preventing others from reshaping that worth into a threat. Catherine's instinct for self-preservation bordered on artistry. She stepped away from the conflict before it reached her. She left debates unfinished when they became heated. She allowed others to underestimate her because underestimation was safer than admiration. Her intelligence did not blaze. It glowed steadily, a controlled flame that warmed without drawing attention. In her private life, Catherine cultivated relationships with caution. She did not lean on favoritism or factional loyalty. She avoided entanglements that offered short-term gain at long-term risk. She stayed close enough to the king to remain relevant, yet distant enough to avoid becoming the centre of gossip. Such a balance was rare among Tudor queens, many of whom were consumed by the court's relentless appetite for stories. Her survival stands as a quiet defiance against the expectations placed upon women of her time. Catherine Parr did not conquer the court, she outlasted it. She did not dazzle, she endured. She did not rise through innocence, beauty, or obedience alone, but through a deep understanding of when to step forward and when to vanish behind a veil of calm. Catherine Parr walked through a palace where danger lived in the breath between words, and she learned to speak only when the air around her was still enough to carry her safely. Her endurance leaves a muted trace on the edges of Tudor history, a reminder that survival can be its own form of quiet brilliance. The court's shifting loyalties settle briefly around her, but their stillness cannot last. Beneath that surface, another woman is already stepping into a role where past mistakes offer no protection at all. Few figures in Tudor history shaped an entire dynasty without ever wearing a crown. Yet Margaret Beaufort managed precisely that. Her life unfolded under conditions that would have fractured many others. Beginning with a childhood pushed rapidly into adulthood, and a motherhood defined by separation more than tenderness. The early instability she endured became the foundation of an unyielding determination, the kind of resolve that grew quietly and effectively in the background of political turmoil. Those who encountered her often saw only a composed, devout woman, never suspecting how much calculation existed behind her calm demeanor. Piety formed the shield she carried throughout her life. It created a respectable surface that few dared to question, and those who did found no contradiction between her outward devotion and her disciplined habits. Religious commitment blended seamlessly with her strategic mind, allowing her to move between households, alliances, and rival factions without attracting suspicion. Her prayers reassured observers. Her silence concealed intentions sharper than anyone expected. It is almost unsettling how respectability can become the most reliable mask for ambition. Henry Tudor's future did not begin on a battlefield or in a council chamber. It began in the decisions Margaret made from the shadows at a time when England was fractured by competing claims. She identified which nobles could be trusted, which alliances were temporary conveniences, and which promises held potential. Before her son ever returned from exile, Margaret had mapped the possibilities of a kingdom barely held together by shifting allegiances. Her correspondence travelled discreetly through routes known only to those she relied on most. Her network, built slowly and deliberately, moved information toward those willing to consider her son as a stabilizing force. Her ability to read political landscapes came from necessity rather than aspiration. Years spent watching powerful men rise and fall taught her that survival required precision. She learned when to speak, when to wait, and when to let others believe decisions were theirs. In another time, she might have been recognized openly for her skill in Tudor England. She used societal limitations as cover. People saw a mother advocating for her child. Margaret understood she was shaping the future of a dynasty. While England endured instability, she cultivated relationships with those weary of conflict. Some sought order, some sought security, and some sought advantage. Margaret knew how to appeal to each group without overextending her influence. Her reputation for moral integrity gave her unusual freedom to approach discussions others would treat with suspicion. Because she was not perceived as a threat, she used that misjudgment to maneuver effectively. In a modern comparison, she resembles the quiet strategist who guides decisions while letting others appear to lead. When Henry gained the throne, many credited fate, military success, or political timing. Margaret's role was less visible, but far more consistent. Her planning had built the scaffolding for his victory long before he arrived to claim it. After the coronation, she did not retreat into ceremonial comfort. Instead, she shifted into a new form of influence, one that blended maternal authority with political insight. Her advice reached decisions that shaped governance, appointments, and the structure of the early Tudor state. Margaret's public actions maintained an image of modesty and religious dedication. She funded institutions, supported scholars, and organized her household with strict discipline. Her private influence, however, remained steady. She helped guide the education and development of her grandson, the future Henry VIII, shaping his sense of lineage and legitimacy. Her signature occasionally appeared alongside the king's, a rare acknowledgement of her authority within the tightly controlled environment of royal administration. The combination of visible virtue and hidden strategy became the hallmark of her legacy. People admired her discipline without recognizing how much of the Tudor dynasty rested on it. She understood that openly claiming power would invite opposition, while shaping power from behind the boundaries of expectation allowed her to operate without resistance. Her decisions rarely appeared dramatic, yet each one contributed to a structure solid enough to support a new royal line. Margaret Beaufort demonstrated that influence did not require a formal title. Her authority developed in the gaps left by others. Moments when officials hesitated, nobles hesitated, and even kings hesitated. She filled those spaces with conviction and direction, steady enough that the dynasty could rely on her even when the realm remained uncertain. While others sought recognition, she sought results, and her patience proved more effective than force. Her presence in Tudor politics remains defined not by spectacle but by consistency. She shaped alliances quietly. She preserved her son's claim meticulously. She maintained order where disorder threatened the fragile stability of a newly established dynasty. Even as she grew older, her influence never diminished. Those around her understood that ignoring her guidance meant stepping into dangerous uncertainty. Margaret Beaufort secured her legacy not through domination but through endurance, clarity, and deliberate control over the spaces where her voice carried weight without confrontation. Her quiet authority leaves a shadow long enough to touch every chapter of the Tudor story. The dynasty she shaped stands as proof of what can be built without ever stepping into the light. Through that shadowed legacy, another woman will find her ascent defined by fear as much as ambition. Stories of Tudor women often begin within noble halls or royal chambers. But Elizabeth Woodville's path started in a far less protected world. Her early life offered no indication that she would one day stand at the centre of England's political anxieties. Born into a family without the traditional power expected of future queens, she entered history not through birthright, but through a marriage that unsettled an entire kingdom. Her rise challenged the expectations of a society that believed authority belonged only to established names, not to a woman who brought neither vast estates nor ancestral influence. Elizabeth's marriage to King Edward IV disrupted the calculations of those who had grown comfortable manipulating royal alliances. She was a widow with children, tied to a family viewed as minor by courtly standards. And her sudden elevation to queen sent tremors through every faction that relied on predictable lineage. Her beauty drew attention, but it was her unexpected presence beside the king that caused unease. Power, acquired by tradition, appeared stable. Power acquired through personal affection appeared unpredictable. It is striking how quickly admiration becomes hostility when a woman steps beyond the boundaries others assign to her. Her new status reshaped more than her own life. It altered the fortunes of her family, granting them titles and positions that rival nobles had long considered their own inheritance. Resentment grew. Whispered suspicions accused her of manipulation, sorcery, or undue influence. These allegations were less about truth than about discomfort. Discomfort with a woman whose ascent could not be explained by the accepted rules of inheritance. To opponents of the marriage, her success was an affront. To her supporters, it demonstrated the possibility of renewal in a fractured political landscape. Elizabeth navigated this hostility with composure shaped by experience rather than privilege. She understood instability because her early years had offered little protection from it. This awareness helped her endure the shifting loyalties of court life. She maintained order within her household, cultivated alliances through her daughters, and guarded her family's standing with vigilance. Yet every gesture she made, no matter how modest, was interpreted through a lens of suspicion. The higher she rose, the more others viewed her as a threat rather than a participant in the politics already surrounding the king. Over time, Elizabeth became a symbol rather than an individual, an emblem of fear for those who believed a woman of ordinary birth had no place near the crown. She represented the idea that lineage could be disrupted, that influence could come from unexpected origins, that the established order was not as unshakable as many wished to believe. A modern observer might see her as someone punished not for wrongdoing, but for existing above the station others felt comfortable assigning to her. Her children became central to England's future, and this heightened the tension around her. The princes in the Tower, her daughters' marriages, and the legacy of her line all intersected with questions of legitimacy. Accusations against Elizabeth resurfaced whenever political conflict intensified. Her opponents portrayed her as dangerously ambitious. Her supporters saw her as a woman trying to protect her family in a world designed to erase women's influence. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between perception and survival. When her husband died, the fragility of her position became painfully clear. Without the king's protection, she stood exposed to the ambitions of rival factions. She sought sanctuary not out of political drama, but out of necessity, guarding her children against forces far more powerful than anything she could command alone. Her retreat marked a shift from public authority to private endurance. Yet even in withdrawal, she remained a figure whose presence unsettled the political landscape. Her very survival represented a potential disruption to those seeking control of the throne. Her later years illustrate a woman whose influence persisted despite diminishing visibility. She supported strategic marriages, maintained ties to those loyal to her family, and ensured her daughters were positioned to survive the dangers of court life. Her daughter, Elizabeth of York, eventually married Henry Tudor, uniting warring factions and stabilizing the realm. Through this marriage, Elizabeth Woodville's legacy became foundational to the Tudor dynasty. A woman once criticized for rising too high became the bridge between fractured royal lines. Her story reveals how fear shapes the narratives surrounding women in power. Elizabeth Woodville became cursed not because of misdeeds, but because she embodied the possibility that a woman of ordinary origins could disrupt centuries of tradition. Her critics used superstition to explain what they could not accept, that influence is not reserved for those born into it. Her life is a record of suspicion directed at a woman who navigated political chaos with resilience rather than privilege. Elizabeth Woodville did not command armies or rewrite legal codes. She survived, adapted, and shaped the path of a dynasty simply by refusing to disappear when others hoped she would. Her strength was quiet but persistent, marked not by triumph but by endurance in the face of hostility. Her troubled legacy lingers where fear and admiration blur, a reminder of how power unsettles those who believe it belongs only to a chosen few. The unease surrounding her ascent does not fade. Instead, it shifts toward the women who follow. Within that uneasy space, another role emerges where loyalty becomes a shadow that watches every step. The Tudor court relied on ceremony, hierarchy, and ritual. Yet the real movement of information flowed through those who were trained to be unnoticed. Servants moved along corridors, carried clothing, prepared rooms, delivered messages, and tended to daily routines with practiced silence. Their presence was constant, and because it was constant, most nobles forgot that silence did not equal ignorance. The court assumed loyalty where merely necessity existed. In truth, every servant lived within a world where survival depended on listening carefully and speaking only when the outcome promised safety or reward. No one understood the value of information better than those who had no formal power. A servant's routine created opportunities. A glimpse of a letter left half-folded. A conversation overheard between chambers. A name whispered when the door seemed closed. These fragments rarely meant much on their own. Yet in a place where suspicion shaped every decision, small details acquired significant weight. It is almost predictable that a position designed to be invisible became the perfect vantage point for observing everything. The court operated on the belief that rank determined influence. Servants disproved that daily. Some traded information to maintain favor. Others exchanged secrets for money, protection, or even a promise that their families would not be targeted during political purges. A few acted out of personal loyalties, but even those loyalties could shift under pressure. The idea of unwavering devotion was a luxury reserved for those secure enough to believe it existed. For servants, security came only through choices made in moments where silence could be fatal. Many executions began with a sentence spoken too close to listening ears. A queen's sigh of frustration, a nobleman's careless remark, a private joke shared at the wrong time. Each could be dismantled, reinterpreted, and delivered to someone who needed justification for action. Servants did not invent accusations. They simply provided material that ambitious individuals could mold into threats. The accuracy of these accounts rarely mattered. The court valued stories that supported its fears more than truths that complicated them. The most dangerous spaces were not council chambers or banquets. They were dressing rooms, antechambers, and private quarters where nobles believed themselves safe enough to reveal irritation, longing, or doubt. Clothing required assistance, and assistance required closeness. A servant fastening a gown or arranging a cloak heard murmurs that could shift the balance of favor. Even small details, such as how someone spoke a name, how they hesitated before answering, how they paced the floor, could become part of a larger narrative used to undermine them. Some servants learned to manipulate these subtle observations. They understood that those in power desperately sought signs of betrayal and were eager to reward anyone who seemed to uncover threats. A servant's recollection, framed carefully, could turn harmless moments into evidence of disloyalty. This manipulation did not require malice. It required awareness of how quickly fear turned speculation into certainty. Those who mastered this dynamic climbed through positions quietly, gaining influence not through rank, but through the leverage of what they claimed to know. The court's structure encouraged such dynamics. Noble families relied on servants for daily survival. Food, clothing, movement, correspondence, yet distrusted them enough to treat them as expendable. This contradiction created an environment where servants held both opportunity and vulnerability. They could expose others. But exposure could also rebound on them if their information displeased the wrong person. Each choice carried risk. Speaking was perilous. Silence was perilous. Only adaptability provided a measure of control. Some servants worked simultaneously for multiple factions. They carried messages from one group to another, revealing just enough to remain useful while concealing details that might endanger them. These individuals understood that court politics operated like shifting ground. Placing both feet in one direction risked collapse. Their survival depended on distributing their knowledge carefully, maintaining the illusion of loyalty without ever committing entirely to a single side. Others, forced by poverty or coercion, became tools for nobles who needed their hands clean of suspicion. These servants delivered letters, planted evidence, or repeated selective information to provoke action. They rarely benefited directly from these schemes, yet they bore the full weight of consequences if a plot failed. Their usefulness made them valuable, but only temporarily. Once their task ended, they returned to anonymity, replaced by someone equally vulnerable. In this environment, trust became nearly impossible. Nobles learned to guard conversations, to dismiss servants before speaking, to hide correspondence beneath layers of clothing or behind locked chests. Even these precautions often failed. A door left slightly open or a hurried gesture toward a drawer could reveal more than a spoken confession. Servants watched. Servants learned. Servants remembered. The safest secrets were the ones never spoken. Beneath the grandeur of Tudor ceremony lay a network of observation more intricate than any formal system of governance. Servants carried the weight of secrets larger than their own lives, understanding that a misplaced word could lead to imprisonment, exile, or execution. They existed in a constant state of awareness, alert to shifts in tone, movement, and behavior. Their experiences demonstrated that survival in the Tudor world depended not on power, but on proximity to it. The court's elegance hides the countless ears that wait for a reason to speak. The stories gathered in silence rarely stay silent for long. Among those listening, one woman soon discovers how a single mistake can turn affection into accusation. Love letters in the Tudor court carried a weight far beyond sentiment. What should have been private expressions of affection became objects of scrutiny, seized by those eager to transform emotion into evidence. Women who wrote them did not imagine that a faded line of ink or an unfinished sentence could one day be examined as if it were a confession. Yet the court's hunger for accusations made even the slightest mark dangerous. A letter was not simply a message. It was a doorway through which suspicion entered without warning. Many women wrote in moments of trust, believing that their words would remain in the hands of the person they cared for. They did not anticipate the constant movement of servants, the shifting loyalties of courtiers, or the silent searches that followed rumours. A scrap of parchment hidden beneath clothing or tucked inside a drawer could be discovered by accident or by design. The content did not need to be explicit. A vague term of affection, a softened phrase, or even a missing signature could be interpreted as proof of disloyalty. It is unsettling how easily affection becomes a weapon when others control its meaning. Once taken from its original context, a letter no longer represents the writer's intent. It became something to manipulate, read aloud in council chambers, passed from hand to hand, or used to support claims that had little grounding in truth. The court valued interpretation more than accuracy, especially when interpretation aligned with political needs. A letter that merely hinted at fondness could be reshaped into undeniable evidence of infidelity. Those accused rarely had the opportunity to explain themselves before the decision had already been made. Women bore the greatest risk. The expectations imposed on them made any sign of affection outside the confines of marriage appear incriminating. A man might recover from rumours of impropriety. A woman rarely did. Her reputation could collapse under the weight of assumptions built around a few lines of text. Even if the letter predated her marriage, or referenced nothing more than a fleeting past acquaintance, it could still be used to question her purity, her loyalty, or her intentions. In a court obsessed with controlling lineage, such questions were often considered justification enough for punishment. Some letters, discovered long after they had been written, became the foundation for entire accusations. A queen's correspondence might be searched during political unrest. Her private writings examined for traces of hidden alliances or unspoken desires. Even letters exchanged with family could be misinterpreted if they mentioned names disliked by the king or his council. A harmless inquiry about someone's health might be read as evidence of conspiracy. The court's approach made innocence nearly impossible to defend, because innocence relied on reason, while accusations thrived on fear. There were those who exploited this system deliberately. Rivals encouraged servants to search for letters. Advisors suggested that written proof would strengthen their claims. Some went as far as forging correspondence or altering genuine letters to imply intentions that were never present. The truth mattered less than the appearance of guilt. A single page could trigger interrogations, arrests, or public humiliation. For women already navigating the delicate balance between visibility and survival, these threats shaped every aspect of how they communicated. To protect themselves, many adopted a cautious approach to writing. Letters became shorter, more neutral, and less frequent. Some dictated messages to trusted scribes, ensuring that no personal emotion appeared on the page. Others avoided writing entirely, relying on spoken communication, even though it carried its own risks. These adjustments illustrate how much fear governed daily life. Love itself became a liability when expressed through ink. The tragedy lay not only in the accusations, but in the lasting impact of these letters on the lives they touched. Families were torn apart, reputations eroded, trials unfolded with an inevitability that made defense meaningless. A woman shown a letter she once wrote might not even recognize her own words after they had been reframed by those determined to condemn her. In many cases, she never learned who delivered the letter to her accusers, or why. The uncertainty was part of the punishment. When executions followed, the letters remained as symbolic reminders of fragility. A page worth less than a coin could decide a fate. A forgotten note tucked away in a drawer could echo louder than years of loyalty. People continued to write because correspondence was essential to court life. But each letter carried the knowledge that it might one day be read by eyes that sought harm, not understanding. Love was not the defining element of these letters. Fear was. The fear of misinterpretation, of betrayal, of discovery. The fear of how words, once written, slipped out of one's control and into the hands of those who valued power more than truth. In the Tudor world, where political shifts happened quickly and suspicion never rested, A letter could close the distance between affection and accusation with brutal efficiency. The fragile pages once meant to comfort became tools that destroyed reputations with alarming ease. The court's appetite for proof turned sentiment into danger. As whispers thickened, another realm of influence emerged, where appearance itself became a tool sharper than ink. Clothing in the Tudor court served purposes far beyond covering the body. Every layer, every stitch, every structured detail communicated a message that could shift relationships, reveal allegiances, or conceal intentions. A gown was never just a gown. It became a silent participant in political maneuvering, a tool used by women who understood that visibility and survival depended on being read correctly, or, at times, not being read at all. The clothing worn each day shaped perceptions as powerfully as any spoken word. High collars framed the face in ways that suggested restraint, modesty, or moral discipline. Women who chose such designs appeared controlled, loyal, and grounded in the virtues the court claimed to value. A collar could elevate or diminish someone in an instant. Worn too low, it invited judgment. Worn too high, it signaled self-protection. These distinctions might seem minor, yet in an environment where reputation dictated one's safety, the smallest detail could influence how others interpreted a woman's intentions. It is almost inevitable that fashion became a language, one that punished any mispronounced syllable. Fabric selection carried its own implications. Colours associated with particular factions or religious leanings marked the wearer as aligned with certain households or political beliefs. A dress of deep crimson might suggest loyalty to one family. A muted blue might suggest allegiance elsewhere. Even the quality of the cloth signalled connections. Luxurious materials displayed favour from the king or noble patrons, while simpler fabrics could reflect caution or strategic neutrality. Women learned to choose materials not according to personal preference, but according to how they wished to be perceived by those constantly evaluating them. The construction of gowns also allowed for practical concealment. Letters could be hidden between layers of stiffened fabric. Small items could be carried unnoticed within pleats or under farthingales. Women who moved carefully used these concealed spaces to protect themselves or others, transporting messages or objects while appearing completely innocent. A voluminous skirt created privacy, where doors and walls offered none. The very garment expected to signal virtue could, in practice, serve as a barrier against intrusive eyes. Gowns shaped social hierarchies. The weight of the fabric controlled how a woman moved, slow. Deliberate steps communicated refinement and discipline. Quickness, by contrast, appeared undignified. Clothing regulated posture, gestures, and expressions, determining how a woman entered a room or even how she sat. These physical constraints signaled obedience to the expectations of court life. Failing to meet these expectations could be interpreted as disrespect, even rebellion. Fashion dictated behavior with an authority nearly equal to the king's. Tailors and seamstresses gained a form of indirect influence. They heard whispered requests for alterations that hinted at shifting alliances. They learned which women needed more space in their sleeves to hide letters, and which wanted stiffer boning to appear more severe. Their work gave them insight into intentions rarely spoken aloud. Although they held little social rank, their proximity to powerful women placed them within arm's reach of information others desperately sought. Clothing also played a role in emotional manipulation. A woman who appeared in mourning garments could evoke sympathy, even if her grief was political rather than personal. A sudden shift to rich colours could signal regained favour or a calculated attempt to redirect attention. The patterns created by these changes shaped rumours more effectively than many conversations. People watched what women wore because clothing rarely lied, even when individuals chose their words carefully. For queens, attire became a measure of legitimacy. A richly adorned coronation gown could reinforce authority. Poorly chosen fabrics could undermine it. Enemies scrutinized every detail, searching for flaws to exploit. Allies expected garments that confirmed loyalty. Failure to meet these expectations contributed to the downfall of several women whose clothing implied independence at times when submission was demanded. Even daily routines were affected. A woman rising in modest wool signaled discipline, while one dressed early in elaborate silk suggested ambition. Servants observed these choices and repeated them quietly, shaping narratives before the wearer even entered public view. The court listened to these stories because they provided clues about shifting dynamics long before formal declarations emerged. Clothing became a buffer between the wearer and the dangers surrounding her. It protected identity, concealed emotion, and allowed strategic ambiguity. A woman could appear compliant even when planning resistance. She could present neutrality while strengthening alliances behind the scenes. The gown she wore created an image others believed, even when it concealed truths no one was meant to see. In the Tudor world, where political survival depended on navigating unpredictable shifts, clothing gave women a tool to communicate with precision. It offered them control in a realm that denied them authority. Every choice, colour, eye cut, fabric, ornament, became part of a delicate negotiation between safety and influence. A gown could not guarantee protection, but it offered a momentary shield in a court where perception was often more powerful than any spoken accusation. The garments that shaped appearances also shaped destinies, turning fabric into a quiet force that guided suspicion and admiration alike. The court trusted what it could see, even when vision proved unreliable. Within that carefully dressed world, alliances formed through gestures far subtler than clothing alone. The presence of ladies-in-waiting in the Tudor court created an illusion of companionship. But behind that facade existed a network of obligations, fears, and shifting loyalties that shaped the fate of the women they served. A lady-in-waiting occupied a position that blended intimacy with surveillance. She was close enough to hear private conversations, witness unguarded expressions, and observe patterns others could not see. Yet she was also far enough removed from power that her survival depended on how effectively she navigated the tension between service and self-preservation. Every noblewoman required attendants, and these attendants became part of her daily existence, dressing her, delivering messages, managing correspondence, and accompanying her through ceremonies. This proximity offered unusual access, an access few men could claim. A lady-in-waiting learned personal habits, emotional weaknesses, and social anxieties. She heard frustrations spoken in quiet moments and witnessed gestures too subtle for public view. Such closeness would inevitably become a source of leverage in a court fueled by suspicion. A single attendant could serve multiple factions without ever leaving her post. By relaying selected details to one group and withholding others from another, she maintained usefulness on all sides. This dual loyalty did not always reflect malice. Often, it reflected survival. A lady-in-waiting who committed too strongly to one faction risked being destroyed with it. Those who remained adaptable ensured their relevance in a world where associations changed quickly, and punishment followed swiftly. The court rewarded those who provided information and punished those who kept secrets from the wrong people. Although sworn to loyalty, ladies-in-waiting lived with a reality that made such oaths fragile. Their wages, futures, and reputations were controlled by the nobles they served. Yet these nobles were vulnerable themselves. A queen could fall in a single day, and her attendants fell with her if they could not distance themselves quickly enough. Many learned to move quietly between allegiances, offering gestures of loyalty that cost them little, while storing knowledge that might one day protect them from accusations. In such an environment, true devotion became almost impossible. Women serving women created dynamics that the court often underestimated. A queen might trust her attendants, believing shared womanhood offered safety or understanding. But the power imbalance made such trust unreliable. A lady-in-waiting from a noble family brought her own ambitions. her family's expectations, and her own fears. One from a modest background relied on the position for advancement, stability, or even survival. Their motives differed, and those differences shaped the way they interpreted every interaction. Some became confidantes, listening carefully to the emotions a queen could not express publicly. Others used that access strategically, shaping the queen's perception or withholding information to maintain influence. A few formed genuine attachments, but even these attachments existed against the pressure of political risk. When danger approached, personal loyalty could be overshadowed by the need to preserve oneself or one's family. These shifts were not always cold-blooded. They were the result of living in a world where one misinterpreted smile or careless word could bring ruin. Letters, gifts, and whispered conversations frequently passed through the hands of ladies-in-waiting. They carried messages between nobles, accompanied queens in private meetings, and observed interactions others never witnessed. Their knowledge allowed them to act as intermediaries, though not always willingly. Some resisted being drawn into political schemes. Others embraced the influence it offered. A few were manipulated by those in power, threatened into compliance, or rewarded for cooperation. The complexity of their position ensured they could never fully escape the reach of court politics. The greatest risk came from being associated with a scandal. If a queen faced accusations, her attendants were questioned immediately. Their recollections, whether accurate or shaped by pressure, became evidence. A lady-in-waiting who admitted too much endangered herself. One who denied too much appeared suspicious. Navigating these inquiries required composure and instinct. The safest answer was rarely the most truthful one. Many learned early that silence protected very little, controlled speech protected far more. A queen's fall often began with the observations of those closest to her. A change in mood, a whispered conversation, a note exchanged in secrecy. These details, interpreted by women who knew her daily rhythms, could become testimony against her. Not all intended harm. Some believed they were performing their duty. Others misunderstood what they saw. But intention mattered little once rumors reached those hungry for justification. Ladies-in-waiting existed in a space where influence and vulnerability overlapped so closely that one could never be separated from the other. They shaped history quietly, not through dramatic choices, but through everyday actions, choosing what to notice, what to ignore, what to repeat, and what to hide. Their roles made them essential and expendable at the same time. They could elevate a queen's reputation or destroy it, sometimes without meaning to do either. To serve a powerful woman in the Tudor world meant carrying the weight of her secrets while protecting one's own. It meant balancing faith and caution, affection and calculation. It meant choosing which truths to reveal and which to bury. Knowing each choice might alter not only one's future, but the future of the woman whose life depended on trust that could never be fully guaranteed. The women who served stood close enough to witness every unguarded moment, yet distant enough to escape blame only when fortune allowed. Their shifting loyalties formed the quiet currents beneath courtly grandeur. Amid those currents, danger soon emerged from gestures hidden in plain sight. Festivals and courtly gatherings appeared to offer escape from the intensity of Tudor politics. Yet these events functioned less as celebrations and more as stages where danger moved quietly beneath polished surfaces. Every feast, dance, and ceremony forced participants into a controlled environment where gestures carried meaning. Silences revealed intention, and mistakes unfolded in full view. These gatherings exposed the vulnerability of those who entered them unprepared. The court valued spectacle, but the spectacle hid a relentless scrutiny that followed each step, each glance, each spoken word. Dancing at court required more than graceful movement. Partners were chosen with calculation, not sentiment. Accepting an invitation could signal alliance. Declining one could imply insult. A single dance performed with the wrong partner suggested political alignment or personal interest where none existed. Observers watched closely, measuring how long hands touched, how deeply heads inclined, and how comfortably bodies moved in sync. It is difficult to imagine a more efficient method of gathering information than forcing rivals into proximity while the court judged the meaning of every breath. Conversations during feasts carried their own hazards. The noise of music and laughter created an illusion of privacy. But servants, rivals, and opportunists listened carefully. Words spoken lightly, intended as jokes, complaints, or casual remarks, could be repeated out of context until they resembled deliberate accusations. A misplaced comment had the potential to unravel a reputation built over years. Guests learned to speak in a measured tone, choosing phrases that revealed nothing meaningful. The safest form of participation was often polite silence. Yet even silence could be interpreted as arrogance or disapproval. Social rituals also demanded strict adherence to behavior that reinforced hierarchy. A woman arriving too early appeared eager for attention. Arriving too late suggested disrespect. Clothing had to reflect not only personal status, but political climate. Wearing a colour associated with the wrong faction invited speculation. Standing beside the wrong person invited rumours. Accepting or rejecting a drink signalled trust or caution. Each gesture carried layers of meaning that changed depending on the room's shifting dynamics. Many used ceremonies as opportunities to observe rivals. The controlled nature of these events made deviations more visible. A woman who avoided eye contact during a dance raised suspicion. One who smiled too warmly encouraged gossip. Even the direction in which someone turned their head could suggest preference, disapproval, or insecurity. Observers, motivated by ambition or fear, collected these impressions like evidence. They shaped narratives that influenced alliances, investigations, and even the king's perception of his courtiers. Banquets introduced risks of their own. Shared tables meant shared scrutiny. People measured how much someone ate, how much they drank, and how animated their conversations seemed. Fatigue or discomfort could be misinterpreted as guilt. A fleeting expression, a frown, a moment of distraction, might be remembered by someone searching for reasons to distrust. Nobles understood that their faces served as unspoken texts that others analysed endlessly. Rituals offered a rare chance for factions to interact under the appearance of harmony. Toasts were delivered with practiced politeness, but their content revealed loyalties. Applause could be too loud or too soft. Compliments could be too warm or too precise. People pretended to enjoy these performances, yet each exchange weighed heavily on the court's unspoken scale of influence. Those who navigated these events successfully gained quiet advantages. Those who faltered, often without realizing it, found themselves the subject of discussions that spread quickly after the celebration ended. Women faced greater risks than men in these gatherings. Their roles required them to maintain elegance and composure, even while managing unspoken expectations that contradicted one another. A woman who appeared too confident was seen as threatening. One who appeared too timid risked being dismissed or manipulated. Dancing, conversing, and presenting oneself became acts of calculated restraint. Their clothing restricted movement, yet they were still expected to appear effortless. The combination of these pressures made public appearances feel like examinations they could not decline. Behind the facade of festivity, opportunities for exploitation thrived. Rivals watched for signs of weakness. A strained smile, a hesitant gesture, a whispered exchange, an unattended cup, a misplaced fan, or a lingering glance could be converted into a rumor. Servants moved silently through crowds, gathering fragments of conversation. Nobles took advantage of distraction to test boundaries or provoke reactions. The appearance of joy concealed the reality that these events allowed observation more freely than the guarded atmosphere of council meetings. Many understood that these gatherings determined reputations more effectively than official statements. A woman who maintained composure under scrutiny gained respect. One who reacted emotionally risked ridicule. Even a single misstep, a stumble during a dance, an overly long pause before answering a question, could be repeated as though it carried political significance. Once repeated, these impressions became difficult to correct. The court preferred gossip to truth, and celebration offered the perfect environment for gossip to flourish. The rituals themselves functioned as camouflage. They projected unity while hiding competition. They encouraged participation while enforcing conformity. They created the illusion of choice while dictating behavior. Celebrations served not to relax courtiers, but to test them. Those unaware of these hidden structures found themselves exposed. Those who understood them recognized that every moment required attention, even while pretending to enjoy the festivities. In the Tudor world, joy was never simple. Festivity was never harmless. Every dance, every toast, every polite exchange existed within a system where survival relied on constant awareness of what others saw, believed, and repeated. The cheerful surface of courtly gatherings concealed tensions that shaped far more than a single evening. The rituals that promised unity often revealed fracture. As these fractures deepened, the stakes shifted toward choices where silence offered no protection at all. Beauty in the Tudor court operated less as a blessing and more as a fragile liability. A woman admired for her appearance attracted attention she could not control. And attention in that world carried consequences that shifted without warning. The court valued elegance, charm, and composure, yet punished any expression of these qualities that appeared mistimed or excessive. Those who relied solely on physical appeal found themselves exposed to a judgment that changed rapidly with political conditions. The admiration they inspired could vanish in a moment, replaced by suspicion or resentment strong enough to spark an inquiry. A single laugh, spoken too loudly or at the wrong moment, could suggest disrespect. A smile toward the wrong person could imply desire or alliance. Even prolonged eye contact might be interpreted as encouragement or defiance. Women learned this quickly, though not always quickly enough to protect themselves. Their movements were watched closely, their expressions analyzed as though each carried a coded meaning. It is revealing that the court treated spontaneity as a breach of discipline rather than a human impulse. Charm became a double-edged presence in a woman's life. When the king favored it, the court worshipped it. When he turned away from it, the same charm became evidence of recklessness. A woman admired for her grace one week could be criticized for impropriety the next. The unpredictable nature of royal attention made emotional presence dangerous. Those who seemed too confident risked appearing ambitious. Those who seemed too reserved risked appearing manipulative. The balance between visibility and caution required constant adjustment. Survival demanded performance. Women developed the ability to create expressions that conveyed nothing or everything. Depending on the situation, a polite smile disguised anxiety. A lowered gaze disguised calculation. A moment of hesitation disguised fear. These performances were not theatrical theatrics, but necessary adaptations to a world where speech could be fatal. The most successful women were those who mastered silence. Silence that reassured. Silence that softened. Silence that allowed others to project assumptions without learning the truth. The court expected women to embody specific ideals while denying them any room to fail. Beauty was admired, but mistrusted. Intelligence was valued, but resented. Emotional warmth was celebrated, but easily weaponized. These contradictions left women constantly adjusting their behavior to meet expectations that shifted according to political convenience. Even humility could be interpreted as deceit if expressed too carefully. Those closest to power faced the most intense scrutiny. A queen's gestures were observed by courtiers, ambassadors, and servants alike. A minor slip, laughing at a comment meant to be serious, pausing too long before responding to the king, or showing discomfort during a gathering, might be remembered, retold, and eventually used against her. The margin for error was nearly non-existent. Many women lived with the awareness that their reputation depended on the reactions of those eager to find fault. The fear of misinterpretation shaped daily routines. Conversations were rehearsed mentally before spoken aloud. Smiles were measured. Eye contact was deliberate. Women learned which topics to avoid entirely. They learned which emotions must never appear, even when genuine. Grief, frustration, and boredom required careful concealment. Expressing any of them created opportunities for others to twist their meaning. Beauty itself often inspired jealousy, strong enough to become political. Rivals questioned a woman's intentions, claiming that her influence came not from loyalty or merit, but from superficial appeal. These accusations grew louder if the king showed her kindness. A compliment from him could be interpreted as a threat by others who wished to maintain their positions. The court rarely saw beauty as neutral. It assigned meaning to it, shaped narratives around it, and used it to justify attacks that had little connection to truth. Many women developed a second self, one they presented publicly to satisfy expectations, and another they hid carefully to protect their own sense of stability. The public self was polished, restrained, and alert. The private self struggled to interpret the ever-changing rules. A miscalculation in distinguishing these selves could lead to ruin. A moment of honest expression, shown to the wrong person, created vulnerabilities that others could exploit immediately. The court rewarded those who blended subtle charm with strategic silence. A woman who spoke rarely but gracefully seemed wise rather than hesitant. A woman who laughed softly rather than freely appeared composed rather than carefree. These controlled expressions created a protective barrier. They allowed her to navigate attention without seeming to seek it. They granted her room to observe rather than react. Such restraint became a form of influence, one that could be exercised without ever appearing overt. In this environment, performance became an essential skill, not an optional one. Those who failed to master it suffered the consequences of being misunderstood. The most tragic cases involved women whose genuine warmth or light-hearted nature led to accusations of impropriety. They did not intend to disrupt the court's expectations. They simply misjudged when it was safe to be themselves. Beauty did not guarantee admiration. It created pressure. It invited scrutiny. It demanded caution. Those who survived learned that speaking carefully was only one part of the challenge. Knowing when not to speak mattered even more. The delicate balance between allure and restraint shaped every step taken by those watched too closely. Admirers could become judges without warning. Amid that uncertainty, another form of survival emerged, rooted not in charm but in belief itself. Religion in the Tudor court functioned as both shield and weapon, offering women a rare form of influence in a world that denied them political authority. Piety created a protective space where motives could be blurred, softened, or hidden entirely. A woman who prayed openly appeared humble. A woman who quoted scripture appeared obedient. A woman who aligned herself with the king's shifting religious positions appeared loyal even when pursuing her own interests. The court, eager to see devotion as virtue, often failed to recognize how carefully such displays were constructed. Many women learned early that religious expression gave them room to maneuver. A prayer spoken at the right moment could redirect suspicion. A reference to doctrine could stall an accusation. A demonstration of reverence could reassure observers who questioned loyalty. These gestures did not need to be insincere. Sincerity was not the issue. The issue was how the court interpreted them. Unsurprisingly, women treated religion not only as a belief, but as one of the few tools available for shaping their own survival. Accusations often weakened when placed against a backdrop of visible devotion. A woman who attended Mass faithfully, who donated to religious institutions, or who maintained a disciplined spiritual routine, appeared less likely to commit the offenses whispered about her. Enemies hesitated to attack someone perceived as saintly. not because they feared heaven, but because the court preferred accusations to feel credible. Piety complicated credibility. It forced accusers to work harder, and in a world filled with easier targets, many shifted their attention elsewhere. Yet piety could also manipulate. Some women used religious commitment to influence decisions indirectly. A well-timed suggestion couched in moral terms felt less threatening to men who dismissed women's opinions but respected religious rhetoric. A carefully chosen verse could steer a conversation without appearing to challenge authority. Even moments of silence, framed as contemplation, could slow the pace of political pressure. Women who understood these dynamics navigated the court with a confidence that appeared gentle but was rooted in strategic awareness. Religious texts offered another advantage. They provided a language of justification. A woman could defend her choices using scripture, presenting her decisions as obedience to God rather than ambition. This framing allowed her to disagree with others while maintaining the appearance of submission. It also allowed her to protect allies or undermine rivals without revealing personal motivations. In a court where confrontation was risky, theological reasoning created a safe avenue for resistance. Some women leaned on religious identity to distance themselves from scandal. When rumors circulated, they intensified their acts of devotion, creating a contrast between public perception and private accusation. The court found it difficult to reconcile the image of a devout woman with allegations of misconduct. Even those who doubted her sincerity hesitated to speak openly, fearing they would appear irreverent or biased. This hesitation often bought the accused precious time to reshape narratives, secure allies, or redirect suspicion towards someone weaker. Others used religion to build networks. Shared beliefs strengthened bonds between women who otherwise had little in common. These alliances provided protection, information, and emotional support. They also allowed women to coordinate subtle forms of influence, shaping the behavior of those around them through the quiet authority of moral example. While men dominated formal religious positions, women shaped daily religious culture within households, guiding conversations and attitudes that often influenced decisions more effectively than official doctrine. The danger lay in misjudging how faith aligned with politics. Tudor England shifted religious identities rapidly. Catholic today, reformist tomorrow, uncertain the day after. A woman who expressed the wrong belief at the wrong moment risked immediate danger. What appeared pious one year appeared treasonous the next. Women who survived these transitions learned to adapt quietly, adjusting their expressions of faith without appearing inconsistent. They prayed more visibly when needed, and more privately when caution demanded restraint. A prayer could protect, but it could also expose. Too much devotion appeared suspicious if it clashed with the king's preferences. Too little appeared insincere. Women walked a narrow path where every religious gesture required awareness of the political climate. Confessions, sermons, and gatherings became opportunities for observation. Rivals listened for hints of defiance. Allies listened for signs of loyalty. Clergy, acting as intermediaries, carried impressions that travelled quickly through the court. Yet, in the midst of danger, religion did offer genuine refuge. Some women found strength in the belief that softened the harshness of court life. They used prayer to endure fear, uncertainty, and loss. Their devotion grounded them when factions shifted and loyalties dissolved. While others used religion strategically, these women used it to survive emotionally, even when survival politically required far more calculation, whether sincere or strategic. Religious expression shaped how women lived and how the court judged them. Faith offered a language through which they could defend, influence, or conceal. It provided structure in a world that constantly threatened collapse. It allowed them to remain visible without appearing confrontational, and to remain cautious without appearing fearful. In the Tudor world, where politics consumed nearly everything, Religion became the one realm where women could assert agency without immediate backlash, though even this agency carried risk if misused or misread. Acts of devotion softened suspicion while concealing motives that silence alone could not protect. The court accepted faith as harmless, even as it shaped powerful outcomes. Beneath that quiet piety, the threat of violence waited for those who misstepped. Executions in the Tudor world were never simply punishments. They were performances designed to shape the behavior of everyone who watched. Public death functioned as a message, crafted with precision, aimed at those who might challenge authority, especially women whose influence created unease in a court ruled by suspicion. A woman executed in full view of the crowd served as a reminder that power tolerated no deviation, and that the boundary between favor and destruction could vanish without warning. The ritual began long before the blade appeared. Officials selected the location carefully, ensuring maximum visibility. Guards positioned themselves to guide the crowd's gaze toward the condemned. Religious figures stood nearby to offer the illusion of mercy. Everything was arranged to present the execution as orderly, dignified, and justified. Yet beneath that choreography lay the court's deepest fear, a woman whose reach extended too far. Her death was meant to neutralize influence, not to address wrongdoing. Crowds gathered early, murmuring about rumors surrounding the condemned. Some believed the official charges, others did not. It hardly mattered. The performance was structured so that guilt appeared inevitable, reinforced by the spectacle unfolding before them. Women in the crowd watched with a mixture of dread and recognition, aware that the condemned had once stood where they stood now, secure, admired, even envied, until a shift in perception recast her actions as dangerous. The condemned woman's clothing played a symbolic role. She was often dressed plainly, her finery stripped away to signal humility before the crown. The removal of jewelry and elaborate fabrics communicated her fall from privilege. Even her hair could become part of the message, pinned or covered to frame her face in a way that encouraged solemn interpretation. The visual transformation from noble figure to subdued prisoner illustrated how swiftly status could collapse. As she stepped forward, the crowd grew silent. The moment she appeared on the scaffold, the entire event became a lesson. Her voice, if she chose to speak, could not alter the outcome. Confessions were unnecessary, innocence irrelevant. What mattered was the impression left on those who witnessed her final moments. The court expected her to display restraint, reinforcing the notion that authority remained unchallenged. A composed death reflected the crown's victory, not her dignity. Public executions also reinforced hierarchy. They reminded the court that women existed within a fragile framework of expectations. Obedient, modest, and supportive of male authority. Any deviation, whether real or imagined, became grounds for punishment. Influence without permission appeared threatening. Charisma became a liability. Even silence could be interpreted as defiance if it arrived at the wrong moment. Women learned to read these signals early, adjusting their behavior to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. The spectacle continued after the fatal blow. The crowd reacted, some with shock, others with grim acceptance. Officials ensured the scene remained controlled. The body was removed with a ceremony intended to underscore the crown's authority over life and death. In some cases, objects associated with the execution were displayed temporarily, reinforcing the message of consequence. Women left the site acutely aware that survival depended not on morality, but on how the court perceived them. Executions of influential women triggered waves of rumor. Whispers spread through chambers, kitchens, and corridors, carrying interpretations that varied widely. Some argued the condemned had been foolish, others believed she had been framed. But regardless of opinion, everyone agreed on one point: power had demonstrated its reach. Even a woman close to the king could not rely on safety. Her downfall became a reference point for others navigating the same treacherous environment. Young women entering court life studied these executions like cautionary tales. They noted how influence, once celebrated, eventually provoked hostility. They observed how charm shifted into suspicion, how alliances transformed into vulnerabilities, and how a single, misinterpreted interaction could trigger irreversible consequences. The performance surrounding execution taught them to measure every gesture carefully, to calculate each word, and to understand the limits imposed upon them. Executions also served a political purpose. By eliminating one woman, the crown could weaken entire factions. Rival families lost leverage. Alliances dissolved. A vacuum formed that officials could reshape to their advantage. The spectacle justified power shifts, providing a narrative that concealed the strategic motivations behind the decision. Public perception became another tool for stabilizing authority, even when that authority relied on fear. The brutality of execution masked the underlying truth. Many women died not because they committed crimes, but because they influenced the wrong people, upset the wrong balance, or embodied traits the court found threatening. Beauty became destabilizing. Intelligence became suspicious. Popularity became dangerous. The court preferred women who inspired little notice, whose presence never threatened to redirect loyalty. A woman executed publicly became a symbol, an example of how influence could be dismantled, how reputation could be weaponized, and how the court's anxieties could manifest in deadly ways. Her fate reminded others that survival required invisibility wrapped in obedience, even when such obedience provided no guarantee of protection. In the Tudor world, executions told women what the law did not need to say aloud. Position was temporary, favor unreliable, and safety impossible to promise. Their final moments revealed how power chose its sacrifices, turning every execution into a warning etched in blood. The spectacle taught those who watched that influence, not guilt, sealed a woman's fate. Within that harsh lesson, the fragile alliances among them would soon show another quiet path to ruin. Friendship among women in the Tudor court carried a form of danger that rarely appeared in official records, but shaped the survival of nearly every woman who moved through those corridors. The idea of sisterhood existed only in public gestures, in polite smiles and shared duties. Yet beneath the surface lay a world shaped by fear, caution, and a constant calculation of risk. No woman could safely assume that a confidant was truly a confidant, and no gentle word could be trusted to remain gentle once it passed into someone else's keeping. Every exchange carried weight, and every shared secret carried the possibility of destruction. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, and noble women all lived under the same pressures. They were expected to remain close enough to support one another, yet never close enough to form alliances that might threaten the crown. Bonds formed out of necessity, but necessity rarely meant safety. The court rewarded silence, patience, and obedience, but it punished loyalty when loyalty interfered with political convenience. A friend could provide comfort one day and be required to testify the next. The shifting demands of power made emotional ties expendable. Women learned early that affection could not protect them. A gesture meant to reassure could be interpreted as plotting. A whispered concern might be recast as evidence of conspiracy. Even ordinary companionship, seated together during meals, walking through gardens, tending to the Queen's wardrobe, could become suspect once rumors began to circulate. In this environment, friendship became a performance in plain sight, fragile and uncertain, shaped by proximity rather than trust. Some women attempted to shield one another, knowing that isolation increased vulnerability. A shared glance could communicate a warning, and a quiet hand on a sleeve might signal danger. Yet even these small efforts were limited by the fear of attention. The court valued information more than loyalty, and those who provided it often earned temporary favor. A woman who confided in someone else risked becoming a bargaining tool. A single admission, misunderstood or manipulated, could shape an entire case against her. Witness statements were powerful weapons. When investigations began, officials sought out women first, knowing they observed details unnoticed by men. They dressed together, waited together, prayed together, and therefore overheard words spoken in private moments. Their recollections could support or destroy the accused. As questioning intensified, fear replaced solidarity. Many women testified, not because they wished harm, but because they believed refusal would bring suspicion onto themselves. Survival demanded cooperation with authority, even when that cooperation meant betraying someone who once felt safe. The court created an environment where women became both protectors and threats. They learned to speak carefully, to measure each sentence, and to leave no trace of their internal thoughts. Written correspondence, private journals, and whispered confidences carried enormous risk. A phrase spoken casually could resurface months later. Reshaped by political pressure, many friendships ended not with confrontation, but with quiet withdrawal. A slow stepping back as each woman recognized the danger of being too close. Some women exploited these uncertainties to advance their own positions. Information became a currency, traded strategically. When an accusation emerged, those who wished to rise offered their memories in ways that ensured relevance. They understood how to present themselves as helpful witnesses without appearing malicious. In the process, they reshaped narratives, tilted suspicions, and redirected blame. Self-preservation guided each move, and friendship rarely survived such calculations. Others were simply caught in the crossfire. They did not seek influence, but found themselves entangled in events beyond their intentions. Their attempts to remain neutral often failed, as neutrality itself was interpreted as concealment. When questioned, they answered cautiously, aware that a single misplaced detail could condemn someone else. Their guilt came not from malice but from fear. Yet fear did little to soften the consequences for those accused. Letters between friends, tokens exchanged, and moments of shared confidence later appeared as evidence in trials. Small gifts became symbols of illicit alliances. Handwritten notes became proof of secret intentions. Emotional closeness, once a comfort, became a legal liability. Women realized too late that the bonds they formed could be reshaped into instruments of their downfall. In this environment, friendship did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became something observed from a distance, offered cautiously, and held with the understanding that it might dissolve when power demanded it. Women survived by reducing vulnerability, limiting confessions, and relying on silence more than trust. The court's expectations forced them to weigh every connection as both a potential support and a potential threat. By the time a woman understood the full danger of intimacy, she had often already shared too much. The court did not forgive mistakes, and it did not forget rumors. Friendships ended quietly, with no explanation, as women stepped away to preserve themselves. Their retreat was not cruelty, but necessity, shaped by a world that left them no safe alternative. The fragile ties among Tudor women revealed how survival demanded distance rather than devotion. The same gestures meant to offer comfort could later sharpen into tools of accusation. Within that bleak reality, another figure would navigate power through solitude rather than trust. Elizabeth I spent her life surrounded by danger, disguised as expectation. Every hallway she walked through held observers who measured her gestures, weighed her reactions, and watched for signs that she might falter. The crown offered authority, yet authority came with a constant pressure that attempted to shape her choices. Her womanhood, her unmarried status, and her lineage all became points of scrutiny, used by both allies and rivals to question her fitness to rule. In such a landscape, solitude became not a preference, but a requirement for survival. From her earliest years, she learned how quickly public favour could change. Her mother's downfall showed her that beauty, wit, and intelligence were not protections. When her sister Mary took the throne, Elizabeth survived imprisonment only because she mastered restraint, understanding that silence could protect her better than explanation. Each episode taught her that dependency created vulnerability, and that reliance on others could become a path toward ruin. By the time she inherited the crown, she understood isolation as a skill. Marriage proposals arrived from every corner of Europe, each carrying political consequences. Some unions promised protection, others offered alliances, but all threatened her control. Accepting a husband meant granting someone else authority over her body, her decisions, and her future heirs. Rejecting proposals brought accusations of pride or instability, yet she continued to refuse. Her unmarried state became a statement that she would not allow her rule to be shaped by the ambitions of any man. The court interpreted her singleness as uncertainty, but it was deliberate. Suitors continued to circle, and ambassadors reported on her expressions as though they were predicting storms. Observers interpreted her gestures, attempting to uncover hints about her plans. Yet she revealed nothing definitive. She maintained an appearance of openness while withholding clarity, creating a space where she alone controlled the narrative. Her autonomy remained intact because she refused to let marriage place her under another's authority. Her household, filled with ladies-in-waiting and advisors, also saw her as an object of fascination. Some hoped for closeness, believing intimacy might grant influence. Others feared the volatility of royal attention, knowing a single misunderstanding could end a career. Elizabeth managed these relationships carefully, offering warmth when needed, but ensuring no one grew indispensable. The appearance of emotional closeness did not translate into genuine vulnerability. She kept her private thoughts shielded behind layers of discipline. Rumours continued to follow her, especially concerning Robert Dudley. Their association created stories whispered in foreign courts and recorded in private letters. Yet Elizabeth resisted the pressure to define their bond. Whether affection existed mattered less than the advantage of ambiguity. By leaving the question unanswered, she prevented foreign powers from exploiting her personal life. She understood that clarity could weaken her position. Her reign demanded constant vigilance. Threats emerged from Catholic factions, foreign monarchs, and internal conspirators who questioned her legitimacy. Each plot confirmed her belief that trust was dangerous. Advice came freely. Yet, she evaluated each suggestion with caution, understanding that every recommendation reflected someone's agenda. Her decisions were measured not only against political consequences, but also against the risk of becoming dependent on those who offered guidance. Isolation, however, did not make her passive. She cultivated an image of authority that blended caution with confidence. Public appearances were crafted to reinforce strength, and her speeches emphasized continuity and stability. She communicated control through tone, posture, and expression, demonstrating that sovereignty was not weakened by solitude. Instead, solitude became the ground on which she built a firm identity as a monarch who belonged to no one. Her subjects came to view her unmarried state as an advantage rather than a deficiency. The idea of the Virgin Queen linked loyalty to symbolism, transforming her personal choice into national identity. Yet behind this image remained a woman who navigated constant suspicion. Every decision she made, from foreign policy to domestic law, was examined under the lens of her gender. She responded not by bending to expectation, but by mastering the art of strategic distance. Loneliness marked her private life, even when surrounded by attendants. Those who served her saw only fragments of her thoughts, and none saw the full picture. Her solitude allowed her to maintain control, but it also denied her companionship, creating a barrier she could not easily cross. She accepted this cost because she understood the alternative: vulnerability that could be exploited by those who sought to shape the throne. In the end, her ability to remain steady under constant scrutiny became the foundation of her success. She endured suspicion, judgment, and pressure without breaking. Her reliance on solitude was not a refusal of connection, but a deliberate strategy to ensure her rule remained her own. Her rise showed how distance protected a woman surrounded by expectations she refused to satisfy. The throne demanded independence that left little room for trust or emotional refuge. Beneath that quiet strength, another story waited in the shadows, where belief, rather than power, decided fates. Trust was the most dangerous element in Tudor life. More unpredictable than any blade, and more damaging than any official sentence. Women at court lived under constant pressure to appear loyal, composed, and obedient. Yet the very act of believing someone could destroy them, a whispered reassurance, a promise of discretion, or a gesture that seemed harmless, could become the thread that unraveled everything. Many women thought they understood the rules, but the rules shifted with the ambitions of others, leaving them vulnerable to forces they could not see clearly until it was too late. Servants moved through rooms unnoticed, carrying trays, arranging clothes, and tending fires. Their presence blended into the rhythm of daily life, creating an illusion of familiarity. Some mistresses grew comfortable enough to confide in them, convinced that long hours spent together created loyalty. Yet a servant's survival depended on their ability to navigate shifting alliances, and information was often the only currency they possessed. A careless confession or a private complaint could be repeated to the wrong ears, reshaped into something more dangerous, and used as justification for punishment. Women who trusted their attendants discovered too late that routine interactions had become evidence. Courtship created another layer of risk. Men understood how vulnerable women were within a structure that judged them heavily while granting them little defense. A single letter exchanged, a glance held too long, or a gesture interpreted as affection could end a woman's life. Some men offered attention not out of sincerity, but because proximity to a high-ranking woman promised opportunity. Others acted with genuine emotion, but underestimated the consequences that came with it. For a queen or noblewoman, misreading a man's intentions could lead to accusations of betrayal. Whether or not any wrongdoing occurred, the danger did not stem from love itself, but from the assumptions attached to it. The most complex danger came when women placed trust in their own judgment. Many believed they could sense loyalty, discern motives, and manage the people around them. They believed they understood how to move through the court, how to avoid traps, and how to read the atmosphere of a room. Yet the Tudor environment rewarded deception and punished clarity. Personal certainty became a weakness, making it easier for others to manipulate outcomes. Women who trusted their instincts discovered that confidence did not shield them against the machinery of political necessity. Examples appeared throughout the century. Some queens trusted their families, only to be used as tools in broader schemes. Some trusted friends believed internal solidarity could keep them safe. But alliances collapsed once fear entered the equation. Others trusted husbands, unaware that affection could shift quickly into suspicion. Trusting the crown itself was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Henry VIII expected devotion, but offered no protection when rumours surfaced. Any woman who believed loyalty alone could preserve her position misread the nature of power. The court treated secrecy as both entertainment and weaponry. People collected stories, passed rumours, and tested how others reacted to sensitive information. Every secret entrusted to another person became a potential threat. The halls echoed with stories of women who spoke too freely, who wrote letters without understanding the consequences, or who shared private thoughts in spaces where walls felt safe but were not. Trust became a form of exposure, and exposure led to vulnerability that others could exploit without hesitation. Women navigating this environment adapted in different ways. Some chose silence, speaking only when necessary. But silence could also be twisted into defiance. Some chose to align themselves with powerful families, believing collective strength offered stability. But alliances broke quickly under pressure. Others tried to control the people around them, monitoring their behavior and attempting to predict their loyalties. Yet such efforts rarely worked in the long term. Trust, withheld or given, carried consequences regardless of intention. The most tragic aspect was that many women did not fail because of misbehavior, but because someone they relied on shifted positions. A servant was bribed. A friend is frightened. A husband is angered. A relative pressured. The blade often came later, delivered through official authority. But the true cause lay in the moment when trust was placed in the wrong direction. By the time the accusations reached the queen or noblewoman, the decision had already been made beyond her control. Suspicion shaped daily life. Yet suspicion alone did not guarantee survival. Women had to balance doubt with functionality, maintaining relationships without revealing dependence. Trust became a calculated risk rather than an emotional bond. Those who managed to survive understood that reliability could not be expected from anyone, not even from themselves. They moved through the palace with caution, measuring each word and gesture, ensuring that no trust extended beyond what was necessary. The stories of Tudor women illustrate that danger did not always announce itself loudly. It entered through familiar faces, routine interactions, and moments of perceived safety. The final blow came not from steel, but from betrayal that had been invited unknowingly into a woman's life. The knife was only the end. The true wound happened long before. Their downfall revealed how belief, not violence, brought many women to the edge of destruction. The court watched each collapse as if it were the natural outcome of their own choices. Within that harsh reality, a legacy would rise from those who endured despite attempts to erase them. The legacy of Tudor women survives not through grand monuments or detailed chronicles, but through the quiet traces left in the decisions that shaped the era. Many of their names were pushed to the margins, documented only when they became useful to political narratives or when their downfall served a purpose. Yet their presence persisted in the structures they influenced, the alliances they altered, and the fears they provoked. The court's attempt to silence them could not erase the impact of their lives, which continued to shape how power functioned long after their deaths. Official records rarely captured the depth of their experience. Chroniclers focused on kings, battles, treaties, and religious reforms, leaving little room for the women who operated within the private spaces where crucial decisions often began. Their contributions were dismissed as incidental, despite their direct involvement in shaping outcomes. Even when mentioned, they were reduced to simple descriptions: obedient wife, rebellious queen, sorrowful mother, dangerous influence. These labels concealed the complexity of the roles they played behind closed doors. Women in the Tudor world navigated authority through subtle acts rather than official positions. They influenced marriages, carried messages, advised kings, and strengthened political factions. Their knowledge of personal dynamics gave them access to information unavailable to men who operated solely within formal hierarchies. The absence of their voices in written records does not indicate a lack of involvement, but reflects a system that valued their influence only when it served the interests of those in power. Their silence was constructed, not natural. Despite this suppression, their existence remained visible in the effects they left behind. A queen's downfall caused shifts in alliances. A mother's ambition redirected succession. A lady-in-waiting's whisper influenced decisions that affected the entire realm. A noblewoman's fear changed the tone of the court. These small movements, scattered across years of uncertainty, contributed to the environment in which the Tudor dynasty evolved. The court remembered their actions even when official history tried to ignore them. The women who survived did so by developing a resilience that allowed them to navigate danger with minimal support. They learned to observe without revealing their conclusions and influence decisions without appearing responsible. Their strategies rarely entered the historical narrative. Yet these methods shaped the expectations placed on future women in positions of proximity to power. Their unseen labor forged paths that others would later follow, even if the world refused to acknowledge who first cleared the way. Some women became symbols long after their deaths. Anne Boleyn's execution created a cautionary lesson about ambition. Catherine Howard's downfall reinforced expectations of obedience. Jane Seymour's brief reign strengthened the idea of purity as a political advantage. Elizabeth I's endurance illustrated how solitude could be used as a shield. Margaret Beaufort demonstrated how maternal influence could shape a dynasty. Their stories circulated beyond official texts, preserved through memory, rumour, and the moral lessons that families repeated across generations. In certain cases, the shock of their experiences created cultural echoes that persisted well beyond the Tudor period. The idea of a woman's reputation as fragile, of her associations as dangerous, and of her trust as a liability took root, partly because of how these women were treated. Their suffering became part of a broader narrative about the position of women in societies that gave them responsibility without protection. Future generations inherited these stories, not as distant history, but as warnings. Their voices may be missing from letters, speeches, and legal documents, yet their presence appears indirectly in the reactions of men. Laws are tightened or loosened based on their behavior. Foreign policy shifted according to their marriages. Religious debates intensified around queens who influenced the king. Court structures changed when their deaths created unrest. The men who shaped the Tudor world did so in response to women who, despite being excluded from formal authority, generated powerful effects. Even those who never reached the throne contributed to the dynasty's legacy. Servants, whose testimonies led to executions, demonstrated how power could be distributed in unexpected ways. Noble women who arranged marriages influenced the composition of future councils. Women who withdrew into silence after witnessing their peers destroyed helped define the atmosphere of caution that became characteristic of the Tudor court. Their influence may have been quiet, but its consequences were lasting. To understand the Tudor dynasty fully, one must look beyond kings and ministers. The hidden contributions of women reveal the emotional, social, and psychological forces that shaped political outcomes. Their stories, though obscured, show how power functioned not only through commands and documents, but through relationships, suspicions, and calculated restraint. Even when erased from the record, they remained central figures within the system that sought to minimize them. Their legacy is found not in triumph, but in endurance. They carried the weight of expectations that could not be met, navigated rules that shifted without warning, and bore consequences for actions often misinterpreted or fabricated. Yet their memory persisted because their experiences reflected deeper truths about Tudor society. Their suffering exposed the instability beneath the surface of authority, and their strategies revealed the adaptations required to survive it. Their lives show how influence endured, even when names disappeared from the record. The traces they left shaped a court that depended on their presence, while denying their importance. Amid those contradictions, a final silence waits to reveal how memory outlasted every attempt to erase it. The Tudor court functioned through a constant pressure that shaped every decision, every expression, and every relationship. Women moved within this system without official authority. Yet their presence created patterns of influence that reached far beyond what the records acknowledged. They observed, calculated, endured, and adapted, all while navigating expectations that restricted their movements and defined them through narrow categories. Their power did not come from force, but from the ability to interpret surroundings, adjust behavior, and react to shifts that others did not perceive quickly enough. The court called them fragile, but fragility was a label applied by those who feared what subtlety could accomplish. The life of each woman carried a quiet record of how survival worked in an environment built to limit them. They learned how to watch without being noticed, how to speak without revealing intention, and how to present an appearance that concealed the weight of their fears. Some used kindness to gather information. Others used silence to avoid detection. A few relied on loyalty, while understanding that loyalty could never be guaranteed. Their strategies varied, but the underlying pattern remained the same. They acted within the boundaries imposed on them. Yet their actions consistently reshaped the political landscape. Every scandal that shook the court began with gestures that seemed ordinary. A glance held too long. A rumor repeated in passing. A smile is interpreted as encouragement. A moment of confidence shared with the wrong person. These moments accumulated until someone was accused, judged, and punished, often without any opportunity to defend themselves. The official reasons for a downfall rarely reflected the truth. The real cause was usually the tension created when a woman's influence became inconvenient for those who held formal power. Executions served as public reminders of the expectations placed upon women. The sentences were announced as judgments of guilt. Yet the underlying message warned others about the limits of acceptable behavior. Women did not need to break laws to be condemned. They only needed to be perceived as disruptive to the balance of authority. Each death reinforced the idea that their presence had to be managed, controlled, or eliminated when it threatened the stability of the court. Yet the institution relied on them more than it admitted, because much of its internal structure depended on the emotional, social, and relational labor performed by women. The most striking aspect of their experience was how little protection they received despite their importance. A woman's loyalty could be dismissed with a single accusation. Her reputation could collapse because of a remark made by someone seeking an advantage. Even queens, who carried symbolic power, discovered that symbolic power offered no shield against political necessity. Their crowns made them visible, but visibility also increased their vulnerability. The same court that celebrated them could dismantle them within days. Still, their influence persisted in ways that outlasted official judgments. When a queen fell, the court adjusted itself around the absence she left behind. When a noblewoman maneuvered alliances, the diplomatic relationships she supported continued after her departure. When a servant shifted loyalties, the information they carried altered plans and decisions at levels far beyond their station. These effects accumulated over decades, creating a historical landscape shaped by countless actions taken in silence. The Tudor dynasty survived not because of strength alone, but because women carried burdens that held the structure together during periods of disorder. They maintained households, stabilized emotional tensions, monitored court dynamics, supported the ambitions of powerful men, and mediated conflicts that could have fractured alliances. Their absence in official accounts does not reflect a lack of contribution. It reflects the limitations of a system that recorded only the actions of those allowed to participate openly in political life. Their stories reveal how control operated within the court. Men made laws, fought wars, and managed diplomacy. But women shaped the internal climate that allowed those functions to continue. Fear, caution, restraint, and loyalty were regulated not by commands, but by personal interactions. The court's stability depended on the women who enforced informal boundaries that were just as significant as formal ones. Their labor remained largely invisible, but its absence would have left the court unable to function. Across the years, their fates formed a consistent pattern. The women who survived longest learned to reduce their visibility, to limit their attachments, and to rely on observation rather than trust. Those who reached too far, confided too freely, or misread the intentions of others, faced outcomes that were swift and irreversible. Their stories provide insight into a world where silence became a form of defense, and where caution offered the only meaningful security. The whispers that traveled through corridors shaped decisions more effectively than proclamations. The glances exchanged across rooms revealed tensions before words were spoken. The downfalls that followed created cautionary examples that influenced the behavior of future generations. These small moments, repeated across decades, defined the lived reality of Tudor women more accurately than any official document. Their experiences show that power did not always appear in grand acts, but in the quiet ability to predict consequences before they unfolded. In the end, their importance lies not in the scale of their actions, but in their persistence. They existed in spaces where their presence was acknowledged only when convenient. Yet their influence remained constant. They were blamed when events went wrong, and forgotten when events went well. But their efforts shaped the atmosphere in which decisions were made. Their endurance, despite the dangers surrounding them, forms the basis of their legacy. Understanding their struggles requires recognizing the complexity behind each choice they made. Whether they adapted, resisted, or simply endured, their actions reveal how limited freedom can still produce meaningful impact. Their resilience challenges the notion that power exists only in visible forms. It shows how influence can operate quietly through the pressure of expectation, the management of relationships, and the ability to navigate instability. The conclusion of their story is not a triumph, but a recognition of their persistence. The court may have silenced their voices, yet the traces they left continue to shape how the Tudor era is understood. Their whispers remain more revealing than the loudest declarations of their time, and their experiences shed light on the hidden mechanics of a society that relied on them while denying their agency. The stories of these women end not with noise, but with quiet evidence of how they shaped the world around them. Their restraint carried weight that official accounts never measured. In the dim spaces they once walked, their presence remains as steady as the history that tried to forget them. Good night. May your rest be calm. And may the echoes of these forgotten lives settle gently as you drift to sleep.